Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure and delight of speaking with Alex today. He is getting up at like 8 in the morning to speak, so a very good man. And I've enjoyed the chances I've had to speak with him thus far. And just one of my favorite things to do is just ask people what they're thinking about. So, Alex, what are you thinking about? What are you thinking about, Alex?
Thank you for asking me. It's good to talk with you again. Um, I was I stayed up till like 1 in the morning last night because I was just I was thinking about the one dimensional man section. Uh, it gets really metaphysical and it brings up the categorical imperative and it's getting real deep and it just it just it just struck me with thinking about historicity and time and how one dimensionality uh the way it considers time is almost like eternal, like this moment will, I guess, last forever, but in order to keep this going we have to have that second dimension and the act of continuance, I guess. And then we I was doing a reading group with Jacob and Johnny, and Johnny recommended a piece by Nietzsche, which is, shoot, I might have to look at the title. What is the title?
Hobo the
Title
clown.
is On the Use and Abuse of History for Life.
Mm.
And I am in love with this piece. It just like I don't know if I can get into really describing it. I definitely would have to reread it. But historicity, and it talks about forgetting, and you want to have a what is it? His not historicity, that's not the word he uses, but you want to remember, but also you don't want to be remembering all the time. You're going to be wearing on the burden of remembering all your failures and what you should do and yada yada. And I've been, I guess I'll say, feeling that tension as of recently. I don't know, just the past 3 to 4 days, life's been heavy. And just managing that, it's been interesting now that, like, I noticed that there's a different relationship to bouncing back from taking on that heaviness. And, funny enough, every time I choose to speak with someone just about what's going on here, it just clears it up. And, it may not cure all the world's problems, but it's a shifting. It's like it creates new cracks and it flows in a different venture. And then you end up reading One Dimensional Man. It breaks you open in a different way. And here we are. And that's what I've been thinking about.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, there's a few things. As you were speaking there at the end there, it brought to mind there's this part I think in Globes where Sloterdijk talks about Atlas, and he points out that Atlas has a beard, which in that period of time was a kind of a clear signification of philosophy, and that we have to think about Atlas as a philosophical gymnast, not just kind of a gymnast, because the idea of the globe on his back, like
Mm,
that globe represents the dark truth, like the full gestalt of being. So it's not merely that Atlas is trying to hold on his back the quote unquote world, which of course the mythology goes, but it's also the idea that Atlas is a kind of philosophical symbol of trying to hold the whole on his back. And that's something that philosophy is trying to do. Now, of course, there's, Sloterdijk. Sloterdijk is very interesting in his, bubbles, globes, and foams. There's almost a kind of phenomenology of architecture that sort of suggests how we think about truth that then that has an impact on how we practically behave, which I think is actually aligns with Marcuse and everything you were saying about time, because arguably nothing has a bigger impact on how we carry ourselves in the world than how we understand time. And so it really matters if we only have a single notion of time that leads to one dimensionality that then could capture us. And I know Marcuse will talk about those things. But anyway, yeah, so for Sloterdijk, if truth is a globe, and there's something about spearing that is tied to human natures because we make this kind of spear and it's this perfect thing, but there could be bubbles that were trapped in globe that's more of gestalt, or foams, which is kind of, I associate with pluralism, where everyone has their own isolated little globe, if you will. And, this idea that there's something about the smoothness, we want everything to kind of connect and then we kind of bear it. And I think I bring all this up because I think with the releasing of philosophical consciousness, as I like to talk about with Hume, after the loss of Gibbons, where today we're all existentialists, basically all of us now have a bit of a life that's like Atlas in this way that Sloterdijk is talking about. We have this kind of experience of trying to hold a hole on our back. Now, of course, you could just say, nah, I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to try to, not think about it. Well, that Sloterdijk is suggesting that would be shrugging. So you shrug, right? And there's an idea that if you shrug, there are consequences. Now, what are those consequences? Well, that gets into a bunch of different things, but we seem to be at a historic moment where shrugging off the philosophical project is politically, economically devastating. But then, of course, thinking the philosophical project means you have a freaking globe on your back you're trying to hold up. So how do you not get crushed under the weight? I do think there is something about speaking with people, writing, reading, that is actually necessary for the atlas, gymnastic atlas, the athletic atlas, the philosophical gymnast that is Atlas, to not be crushed under the weight. And then, of course, the thing I want to say is basically, until the social coordination mechanism, which you and I are using right now, it was logistically too difficult to have the regular discussions and conversations needed in order to free yourself of that burden that you were describing. And so in a certain sense, it was better not to do philosophy at all, you could argue, or to just live near a college where you could have those conversations. But of course, that gets into class selection, money, and all that stuff. And that is inadequate coordination for a world that is under philosophical consciousness. Globalization, it's a huge claim, getting to Berger and different, like, we're all existentialists now, is what Berger said. Every one of us. And so if only the people around colleges are able to actually carry out the practices needed to not be crushed under the globe, well, that's not going to be adequate. You need far more people to be able to participate in that, right? And furthermore, you could argue institutions are too slow for the level of processing needed because they're captured by incentives and things like that. And then if you say, well, then let's just repress it. Well, that's what a lot of people have been trying. That's why we've had this popularism, totalitarianism, all these different movements where people are trying to overcome anxiety, because anxiety is a philosophical feeling, with different political platforms that keep out otherness, right? So, I mean, that's what you're seeing. So if you're not going to go to one of those two angles, then you have to actually get good at holding that globe on your back. And that there is something about talking with people, writing and speaking regularly, that is, in fact, the training to hold that globe. And we've just not had the coordination mechanism by which to do that for the average person. But we need now to do it for the average person, because increasingly the average person is under philosophical consciousness, even if they don't know it, even if they've never even used the word philosophy. The moment you turn on Fox News or CNN and you're talking about pluralism and otherness and difference, you've entered into the realm of thought. And so, that's like democracy. If it's going to, well, this is why everyone's turning against democracy. Democracy kind of fundamentally requires philosophical skill. And if you don't have that, you end up in a lot of trouble. Now, the next thing is Marcuse, but before I talk about him, because I think he's got a lot of important things to say, I'll just pause if you have any response to any of that.
I think about something that Nietzsche mentions on the use and abuse of history for life. Is sort of it, not used in this language, but you've used this language of like reactiveness of the nervous system. Like it's quite apparent in, well, I mean, my group of youths that I see, you notice that the kids who take losses, they can take a loss in some game that we're playing, or they don't get their blanket or whatnot. Like, that we still have that reactiveness as adults, and we can choose to shrug it and just like not even pay attention, and the tension's on my shoulders, and oh, that must be a thing that I need medication for or whatnot. And instead it's this turning to face it and to hold it, sort of like a workout, and um, conditioning yourself to not not to react, but in that reacting, it's an observing, but also like you genuinely, I guess I could say, take yourself seriously. Like go with that thought, run with it, and um, I don't know, end up with it where it goes. And this could be for, I mean, I could say action or philosophical inquiry or just self-inquiry. And that just seems like the right way to describe that sort of exercise.
And the claim I'm making that, would need elaboration, but is basically that lack of nervous system regulation, or this kind of death. People seem to be really struggling with the nervous system, if you will, and Aspasia and Seth will talk about that all the time. That is tied to the unleashing of philosophical consciousness. Like those things go together. Like that, like globalization, encountering otherness, complexity, all of those go together to kind of define our moment. And actually, the claim is that there is something about philosophical work and inquiry that is actually learning to manage your regulatory system. And kind of an example of that is like when people, well, what ends up happening as just kind of an example, if you're say a conservative in America, you naturally experience conservatism as not simply a worldview, but the view of the world. And you may give it lip service when somebody says it's a worldview. Oh, yeah, we're all different. But practically, no, you can't actually hold your map as if it's a map. That's the whole problem. We can't literally, we can say the map isn't the territory, but when it comes to living, we can't do that. And yet, in a weird way, we need to. Well, that seems like an impossible contradiction. Well, that's part of our moment. And so what ends up happening is when you encounter the liberal, and actually this I think does directly tie to Marcuse, when you encounter the liberal, you must naturally experience them as the American conservative as wrong, as in like incorrect, right? And you can say all day we learn from other sides. Yeah, but to what degree do you actually put that into practice and believe that, other than say that to sound like a good participant in democracy, right? So what I'm trying to say is there's in that tension, there's like a contradiction, right? That you have to manage, where you're open to the other, even though you think the other is wrong. Well, why in the world would you be open to the other if you think they're wrong? All you could do is lose something. All you do is have something to risk. It's uncomfortable, right? Why would you do it, right? Um, if you don't have, say, philosophical practice or like the idea that difference and tension is good for you, like that's an idea. Like we know that when it goes to the gym, like it's hard to work out. But when it comes to the philosophical gym, we don't really like, why would you think that? It's very hard to think that. It is very difficult to think that you need otherness. We can say that, but to actually live as if it's true is very, very difficult. Well, in a global, interconnected, pluralistic world, you have to actually reside in that contradiction all the time, like constantly. And if basically you only experience nervousness or anxiety as evidence of something wrong with you that you need to treat, or evidence that you need to avoid and get out of the environment, well, then you're going to medicate, you're going to exit, you're going to isolate, and that's all going to be good for your health. And in a way, it would seem like it was, because don't you feel better after the medication? Don't you feel better after you leave? Why would it ever occur to you to think that actually, no, this feeling better is bad because you're not developing that nervous system? And then furthermore, if you have a society that doesn't teach philosophy, now I do have to add, the question that would follow is what are actually the skills and capacities and all of that I'm referencing? Well, that would be thoughts and map is indestructible, blah, blah, blah. So you'd have to go one by one by one on all of that stuff. But so, that happy to get into that, but that gets into the books and stuff. But the point I'm getting at is basically you're only going to train your nervous system through an anxiety and difficulty that you could interpret not as training of your nervous system, but evidence that you need to actually, you're damaging your nervous system or you're putting yourself in a dangerous situation. Well, where would the thought come from that actually you need to go through that? Well, I would argue, like, almost by definition, it has to be philosophy, because even, like, let me also put it this way. Let's say for some reason you accept the premise that you need otherness. Like, you accept that premise. Well, without philosophical training, you're not going to be able to handle it. It's not going to be productive. It's not going to be something that's going to go well because you don't know what you're doing. Like, and in a way, you're almost worse. You could be worse off to go into something where, it's something you need to do, but you don't know how to do it. Almost like handling fire. If you don't know what you're doing when you're handling fire, maybe you need fire to cook food, but if you don't know what you're doing, you could die. That's just how reality works, right? So philosophy is very, very connected to me, with nervous system training, especially when you're dealing with the encounter of otherness. And we have a system that wrecks everyone's nervous system, doesn't train them to develop their nervous system. But then you could argue the system wants that because it makes good consumers or people dependent on power in the capital nation state, as Karatani says. So that's a major potential problem. Um, but if you don't develop in the way that's describing, then I think you ultimately find yourself crushed by that Sloterdijkian globe, and you think, well, then I should shrug. I mean, what else would you think, right? I got to shrug. Well, okay, you do that, but then you're in trouble. And I guess what I just to begin kind of gesturing toward Marcuse, our conception of progress does not help this at all. Because basically, if you start feeling anxiety in your nervous system, then that is a technical problem to be solved away. And you would not actually assume that, well, you're feeling this because the world has actually progressed into a contradiction that we need to confront. There's, like, in a Hegelian sense, you'd say, oh, there must be something wrong with me, because history is progressive. It gets better. So it can't be that the world has ended up somewhere problematic. It must be that I'm out of line with the program, or these people are out of line with the program. We're out of line with the progress of history, but it couldn't be that actually history has developed to a new contradiction that needs to be confronted. And that, I am a fan of Hegel's progress, which is different. It's different than what most people mean by progress. It's the idea that, yes, the world gets better through time, but it does through contradictions, and there's no guarantee there's a future. Yeah, if we get through the contradiction, the world is better than it would be if it didn't. But there's no guarantee we will. And furthermore, progress feels like purgatory. That's the other key. Progress feels like purgatory in Hegel. In the kind of more liberal conception that Marcuse is critiquing, progress feels great. And you see, that's a problem, because then you would never associate feeling anxiety as something you need, that is the road to progress. You would assume that is the road against progress, and that the medication is the progress because you feel better, right? So this is where the conception of time really, really matters. And of course, Marcuse makes all these examples, basically game theory problems, where, if everyone wants to get home early, the rational thing is to race out of work and you're in a car jam. Like that example, right? Like rationality that just follows what is self-evidently the best course, actually is likely to end up in rational impasses and suboptimal results all the time. And lurking in the background of that mistake is a conception of history that is kind of worsening that mistake, because you're thinking that things are getting better. Like, so we're becoming more rational with time. Therefore, if it's rational to hurry up, you end up in a multipolar trap, et cetera, so forth. But I'll pause on any thoughts.
And it, like, this going with progress, and I mentioned previously, like, the idea of, like, the historicity and non-historicity, like remembering and forgetting, and that's also like a tension and contradiction that is like the brakes and the gas for confronting that pain and anxiety and the pluralism. And man, that's just it's just like like a seesaw balancing on a cylinder, and then you have another cylinder and a seesaw. It's just this whole contraption. And I'm looking at this self-sabotage book by Todd McGowan, and I just wanted to ask you, like, it brings up uh, self-sacrifice and self-sabotage and
Mm.
how they're distinct. And from my understanding, self-sacrifice is more of a conscious um, effort to put forth and fulfill one's fantasy. You kill yourself for the cause, and you live forever in honor because of your sacrifice. Then self-sabotage is um I almost want to say that it's like the real intruding, but also in some cases you almost set yourself up to then experience that break. And that Todd McGowan argues, like, self-sabotage is where emancipatory politics can occur. And it's maybe not in the self-sabotage, but like noticing that is we are in that dialectic of like positing forth, and then we like to undermine ourselves so that we can keep positing forth, and in that process undermine ourselves, positive forth. And that connects to another thought of, like, imagine like conditioning people or introducing people to philosophical work and self-work via just like being like meta and just speaking uh I guess I almost wanted to say metaphorically. I don't know if that applies, but just just how dynamics work and like forms of like words and also concepts and that whole wrestling arena. And it's just it's interesting to try and posit that to um again, I pertain it to my youth because I'm just interested in how the developing brain, like in different stages, notices themselves and how they act and how other people act, and that realization. And perhaps it's that broadening of, I guess, remembering the past, like you're incorporating that. You're not in a perpetual state of now, like how Nietzsche describes it as animal time or whatever. And yeah, just positing meta reflection, and also that question about self-sabotage and self-sacrifice. That's what makes me think about.
Well, I've not read Todd's book, but that topic is really, really important, and I'm very interested on that distinction between self-sacrifice and self-sabotage. If I were just to, and I'm not saying this is what Todd is saying in his book, Dr. McGowan, but just my own thoughts on it. Self-sabotage is extremely interesting in the sense of if you know you're doing it, it doesn't work as well. And furthermore, why do it? Well, there's many reasons. One, if there's a kind of way that you can keep desire alive by constantly keeping yourself from achieving the object, and if what we really want is to desire, and I know Nietzsche basically says that, Lacan, then this is a way to maintain desire, right? And furthermore, it maintains plausible deniability that thing you would get would actually fulfill you because you never get it, so you don't know for sure. So it kind of maintains that. And then furthermore, there is something about self-sabotage that is avoiding the real that actually courts the real. Like, because what you're doing is that as you do it, the day can come where suddenly you're forced to face yourself as engaging in self-sabotage and the real comes breaking through, right? And you kind of can encounter it. There is something about also, though, on the kind of the idea of emancipatory politics, where if one is aware of the mechanisms of so there seems to be a difference, or let me just say, in my opinion, there's a difference between self-sabotage unveiling itself to you by surprise, and that's when the real breaks through and you could be destroyed, like it could overwhelm you, versus actually coming on your own to be aware of mechanisms of self-sabotage, which then introduces the real, but not in a manner that necessarily destroys you, because you
Mhm.
actually integrate and can handle it, right? I personally, I think psychoanalysis, like this is my view, and I'm not saying this is what Lacan or anyone says. This is just my talking. I think there's always a question in psychoanalysis of if improvement is possible. Like, is there such thing as improvement, right? Or is it always just kind of ultimately going to fall back into some sort of symptom and stuff like that, right? Now, there's a weird thing where the moment you say that you can improve, psychoanalysis teaches us that therefore you're not, right? But what if it's more like a kind of Christian conception where you're like, I'm always a sinner, but that's actually what opens you up to sanctification, right? There's kind of a weird move here. Obviously, as a Christian, I lean toward that second one. I think improvement is possible, but it's dangerous to talk about improvement. And if you think you can handle something, you cannot. And so psychoanalysis can bring to your attention the dangers of talking about improvement. And so furthermore, the reason why I bring that up is because I do think we can I do not think that I think the real can destroy us, but also there are ways of dealing with the real that do not destroy us. And it's a not self-evident process, and it's very, very difficult, and so on and so forth. And to me, a people that can quote unquote handle the real better, that's the emancipatory politics. That's where the emancipatory politics begin. I also associate the real with the potential for the strike of beauty, like it's Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses. The very conditions by which the real destroy us are also the potential for the strike of beauty and elevations of subjectivity and childhood in the Nietzschean sense that would not be possible otherwise. Now, that's my claim. I am not saying that that is necessarily what other people think, but I'm thinking about that as you speak, because to me, when you're this idea of the recognition of self-sabotage as emancipatory politics, I would suppose McGowan may argue in his book that the mechanism of self-sacrifice leading to emancipatory politics has been overly captured by the system. Like self-sacrifice is now what you do in your 9 to 5, and it's the logic of capital. And there's an enjoyment in the self-sabotage, and therefore it doesn't work, even if perhaps in another historical period there were ways to engage in self-sacrifice that, could be a religious martyr or open up the beautiful or open up new horizons of possibility. And maybe here you even talk about the scapegoat mechanism after Girard no longer actually functioning. It's actually everyone's a scapegoat now. So it doesn't actually have any sort of new horizon potential, right? So now I don't know if that's what McGowan argues. I would wager that would at least be a fair claim. So therefore you would look at self-deception, because there's also something about the system, the capital nation state, that needs people to continually self-deceive themselves into believing that the object of desire can be, achieved and fulfilled and blah, 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 right? So the ground zero of emancipation would be denying that mechanism, saying, nope, that's not how it works. So therefore you become conscious of self-deception. Okay, so you're conscious of self-deception. But what would that mean exactly? Like, what would that mean exactly? Well, for me, that gets into all the stuff of enclosure, like, where you're constantly aware of enclosure, you're paying attention if you're kind of falling into something that conceals itself in advantages. Like, we are always 24/7 at the risk of enclosure. I associate that with stuff like spiritual warfare, and I don't, in that kind of like this kind of form and things that you're falling into that conceal you. And basically, emancipation will come from a people aware of the problem of enclosures and self-deception that are living their life in a manner to avoid it, which means that they're also turning down mechanisms of avoiding the real. But that also means they're open to possibilities of the beautiful and developments of subjectivity and this is fundamentally a philosophical consciousness, like it has to be, like, because you have to have that live discernment and judgment, and you're able to see metaphysical realities, basically. Like self-deception is not something you see like a computer screen. It's something that you see in pattern. But this also gets into the memory stuff. So two points, and then I'll give it back to you before saying more. But if you believe in a conception of progress, like there's a way in which the self-deception functions to make the idea of liberal progress plausible. Because like if you actually acknowledge self-deception, you would say, wow, we've created a capital nation state that seems to like require mechanisms of self-deception in order to run. Is that really progress? Interesting. But you would not think to have that sort of critical eye if there's an assumption that the world is getting better, that it's progressing, that therefore, that notion of progress removes critique, right? It's going to remove, and I know the Frankfurt School would emphasize the critique, etc. So that conception of time is a very big deal. The other thing that I was just going to say is, if we're looking at Augustine, Bergson, Plato, all these cats, Hegel, memory is everything. Like without memory, you basically are just going to you have no way to stop the pull. You have no way to stop the pull of history, right? The brakes are memory. But you see, this is the thing. What is the difference between thinking and philosophical thought? Like, what's the difference between those two, right? Philosophical thought is the possibility of brakes. You can put brakes on. That's kind of the difference. And honestly, when people talk about critical thinking, unfortunately, most of the time people just mean thinking better. But if critical thinking is different in kind, then it's philosophical. It's the capacity to put on the brakes, right? Or else you're going to be that angel of history just pulled along by progress, just pulled along by appearance and the seemingly, right? And so philosophy, now so you have memory that can put on the brakes because you think to the past. And without memory, you can't spot patterns. And if you can't spot patterns, you're almost destined for self-deception or some form of enclosure and not realize you are. You're going to fall into something because you have no contrast. You have nothing to contrast it to. There's basically two ways to put on the brakes. Like you have to slow down your thinking in a certain way. Like philosophy slows down thinking to keep it from being swept away, right? There's kind of in my opinion, two main ways you do this. Memory and encounter with otherness, like the other, and taking them very seriously because I can't occupy your mind. I can't occupy your consciousness. There's a wall there that I'm confronting, that therefore I have to slow down, back up, and go, well, let me orbit this, right? So if progress is an arrow, the kind of time we need to recover is the orbiting, which is kind of our, agricultural, circular, but it's a different kind of circular. It's not just merely the seasonal repetition, fall, winter, spring. There's an orbiting to thought that we've lost because we either just progress, technological thinking, or maybe you have thinking that is agricultural, the acknowledgement of the seasons, but a risk of that is being overly passive. It's just kind of thought that is aligned with nature. But then there's a seemingly sublation that is orbiting, which is where, no, you're making progress, you're orbiting, but you're progressing through that which you can't completely conceptualize, or that which is in contrast with the technological essence. And you can do that with the encounter of otherness. This is why empathy is not merely emotional, but if it's done right, it's actually kind of the highest critical thought. Empathy is not merely where you put your shoes in another person's shoes. It's where you put your feet in another person's feet. You literally try to occupy another map, which you could argue is impossible. Yeah, but that very impossibility is actually why it puts the brakes on thought, slows it down, and it can avoid rational impasses. In the same way that you never actually return to the past in memory, right? You know how memory is kind of vague and you're trying to recall and it's really hard? Yeah, that impossibility of occupying the past is why it can function, put the brakes on, right? And so the difficulty of thinking another person's thoughts and the difficulty of memory are why you put the brakes on. And Marcuse, in my opinion, is basically screaming, we don't think unless we can put on brakes. We create a kind of simulacra of thinking. We create an appearance of thinking, but it's not actually thinking. And in a similar way, you could say thinking as such is a kind of self-deception too, like a kind of self-sabotage and self-deception for me go together. Because I think often you're self-deceived, and that's why it's plausible to you you're not self-sabotaging, therefore the desire stays alive. So those kind of, that Frankfurt book, Henry Frank, he had a book on self-deception. Those things kind of go together. But basically, if you're not able to put the brakes on, then you're going to just like not be able to ever spot your self-sabotage or your self-deception. You're just going to be in the motion of it and therefore never stop it. So there's an argument to be made that philosophy, and therefore, in a sense, thinking, like real thinking, requires memory and or otherness. Those are the two sources of philosophical thought. And without those, you have no brakes. Like you have no breaks. Now, by otherness, I can also be including like God and metaphysical dimensions because that's other, right? So, otherness and memory, those go together. And then in like Augustine and other people, it's like, hey, what if those are like kind of the same thing somehow? You get into that fun conversation in kind of meta. But anyway, so yeah, we have to put the brakes on. And if we don't, then we're stuck in something, a kind of merry-go-round. And basically self-sabotage will not stand. But basically the move then, and I'll throw to you, the move then is to step back and see all that. Like everything we just said, you step back and you see all that. Oh, I see all of that. Oh, okay. Well, now we're emancipatory politics is possible because you see all that. You see the form, you see the merry-go-round, you see all of those things in operations. Only the subject who can see all that, which is a meta move. You jump out and you look in, the fish sees the water they're in. Well, now emancipation is possible. The fish can't have emancipation until it sees the water. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So, but now that you've seen the water, well, now you've seen the water. What are you going to do about it? And that could be the real coming in and overwhelm you. And you're like, I don't know what to do. So you're overwhelmed, right? You're Atlas with that globe on your back and you don't know what to do. So you're tempted to shrug. Well, this is why you then need, like, don't see the water unless you're going to be on the social coordination mechanism in a certain regard, because you need regular training, regular conversations, regular writing. And you could say, well, I don't have time to that. I don't have time, energy, as Dave taught. I don't want to do it. But the issue is the world is such where you're increasingly basically forced to. Like that's a giant sociological claim. The world is increasingly such where you're kind of forced to see the water. And as Nabokov says, you can't unsee what you see. Once you see, you can't unsee. So what now? Well, then you're gonna have to learn how to deal with the big, globe on your back with seeing the water. But let me pause.
It was really good. I mean, that just has me thinking of the idea of preparation and what you've written about in Belonging Again and Map is Indestructible, the conflict of the mind, and there's also the which I'm not too I have some thoughts where it pertains to Seth Dillinger and Aspasia's focus, which is on the body. And, like when you work out, you're in that tension. When I first started to wane on wanting to work out, is because holding that tension, it's like, oh my gosh, there's like 10 more reps and I'm already feeling it. And it's like holding that, like I'm already done. Like, what's the point of this? And I guess I would say that, like, physical challenges and also just actions, like last night, you just have your mind racing and you just take one breath and you just notice that previously you were just like holding a tremoring breath here. It wasn't actually coming in and out. It was just this weird in between. But it just makes me think about those physical challenges or practices, experiences that can be used as analogy or metaphor for holding tension, for certain experiences and potentially meta moves. That's how I like to think about it. And again, I'll circle back to preparation. And yeah, I would just like to hear about maybe I guess we'll say particulars of like a subject who is coming into the current time, and it's interesting to think about communities and like how do you even get meta move seers, meta move enactors, some fish who jumps out of the water?
No, I think those are excellent questions. No, Seth asked, we'll talk about the body as an antenna, as like thought is an antenna, like almost like radio frequencies. And you see the antenna is not just the brain, even though the brain seems quite important. It seems as if it's all mind in a certain regard, like it's all antenna. And there's stuff like, yeah, like working out helps your memory. Working out helps your the ability to regularly go to the mall and talk with people, helps you not being in your head unnecessarily, right?
Mm.
But then, of course, there can be going to the mall to not think because you want to be distracted all the time. So you better also have a practice of reading and writing, right? So there's this kind of like what I always, with on the authentic resonance series that we talk about, there's always this question, like an antenna, you have to have all the parts, every dimension of it, like tuned up or aligned or so on, or it doesn't get the signal, right? It has to be in the right location on the right frequency. I think we need to think about thinking as something afforded by, maintaining maintenance, working on the entire being, the entire body. And there are parts of you that can't be worked on without encountering otherness, without improving memory, without learning the right interpretation of emotions. And that also, like, yeah, I mean, a really big thing is meta moves. Like, we like that. That's really, really important because, for example, emotions don't tell you what they mean. You can feel them and you should treat them with respect, but what exactly do they mean in regard of what you should do? You have to have this ability to jump out, examine the emotion, kind of work with it to say, okay, I'm feeling anger. Okay, anger is not innately bad. So where did this come from? What should it be directed to? And actually, you have to have the ability to look at your emotions or look at your own thoughts, right? That's actually really important. And there could be an argument that not that I want to stress developmental logic because some of that can be dangerous, but there's a way in which perhaps post-modernity is the period where the antenna collectively realizes it needs to be capable of meta moves because our main problems now are totalized. It's global. It's water, like the fish, right? Perhaps before modernity, our problems were not fishes in water. Perhaps our problems were fishes who need to get to water. But now our problems are we can't see the water. Well, that's a self-reference matter then. You have to have the ability to look down at yourself. Well, that's something you could argue post-modernity is all about, that ability of the metatext, the meta move, right? But then what do you do with the meta knowledge? Like, what exactly are you looking at yourself to do exactly? Are you looking at yourself to have a fun in the funhouse John Barth novel with cool kind of techniques and the Pale King with Wallace or something like that, which all have a very important role? Or are you looking at yourself to see if you're tuning the antenna correctly? Now, of course, how do you know when you've attuned the freaking antenna correctly? What would be your sign of actually successfully doing it, right? Well, this gets back to basically how you handle experiences of the real, how you handle surprise, how you handle otherness, how you handle things that were not expected. And I think also with that, like there's a bunch of things here because this is important. There's also something about I want to kind of argue that on the prepare plan distinction, because plans are not bad. You're gonna have to make a plan if you're gonna go to Food Lion today. The issue is where you try to plan the next 5 years of your life, or you try to replace preparing with planning, right? So it's always about order. There is a sense though in which it's not there's a way in which when you're talking about emancipatory politics or childhood in the Nietzschean sense, it's almost like, and I don't want to throw out a number, but it's almost like 90% preparing, 10% planning. Like a very large percentage of your life is actually preparing. And that just looks like being interested, following ideas, learning, and like literally, because another thing to think about it, we tend to have an idea. So well, actually, to answer, this gets into time again, with Marcuse, because the first step on making people who philosophize their life, for example, right? Like that's kind of the overarching question. Like how would you introduce people to it? Well, um, the first, as a beginning move, most people think the success in their life is tied to a kind of linear, every single day I work a 9 to 5 and I kind of build up my bank account, right? And that's how you think you succeed. And that's basically the social contract that more and more people are feeling has failed. Yeah. Where instead, actually, I think a lot of major success is due to and I think we talked about this, like 5 or 6 key decisions at key moments, right? Where you're just going along and then bam, right? And you get an exponential curve, right? Um, I think you can begin to make people interested in philosophizing. They're like, well, one, if they're dealing with mental health issues or their family is falling apart or they have disaster and everything they've tried doesn't work, well, then people in those circumstances can be open to trying things they haven't tried before, right? So that can open people up. Strikes of beauty can open people up. That's certainly the case. People's understanding of what it is to be practical or to invest in the future. That's a lot. That also is a very big deal. Like people's idea of what is practical or responsible is tied to what they think is good for the future, right? So most people's notion of what's good for the future is basically building up the bank account, compounding, climbing the corporate ladder. Well, that's a conception of time that's progressive, like Marcuse is saying. It's like you just follow the arrow, right? So the logic of the one-dimensional man, and Marcuse knows this, is history and the corporate man go together very, very strongly, right? But if instead you have a conception of time that is more actually, I want to say, like Moses in the wilderness with sheep until the burning bush, like kind of holding, like making a space for the event, if you want to use that language even, for the kind of breaking through. Well, that's a conception of time where it's like this and then like this, right? And really, those kind of key moments, now I'm suggesting those are the emancipatory politics moments, like people who can handle those kind of moments. But those are moments of the real showing up. And so if you're not prepared for it, that moment of event could actually destroy you. But if you're prepared for it, it opens up emancipation and beauty and things like that, right? So the question then becomes, how do you prepare for it? Well, a good kind of starting rule of thumb is we talk about all the time is every single day, don't like develop courage. Face the things you're afraid of. Do the courageous little acts. And I think if you did little micro courageous acts constantly, that leads you toward freaking childhood in the way Nietzsche's talking about. Acts of courage are a really big deal. No, thinking about life primarily as preparation for the unexpected. Yeah, you got to pay your bills because otherwise you don't have a place to live and you're kind of taken out of the game. But you're thinking about making a space for something that you're prepared for, something that actually you can handle, an opportunity that arises. But that also means you have to put yourself in regular, robust social environments of encountering otherness where things can occur. You're also working on your ability to use memory. You're also working on oration. You're working on all those different things because you're thinking about what it means to be responsible is not just, again, there's nothing wrong with making money and putting it in the bank, but we tend to define responsibility as a person that's staying aligned with the one-dimensional man, kind of the compounding thing. No, responsibility is tied to your ability to respond to the strike, to the surprise, to the finding out that you're self-deceived, to the things that could destroy you emotionally, but you're actually able to hold the tension. That ability to respond to the surprise actually is how we need to think about being responsible. But then the question, like, well, how do you do that? Well, that's all the skills of philosophy. Like, those are all the capacities for philosophies, meta moves, things of that kind of nature. Those are opening thoughts. And obviously, and I appreciate you reading all of those books. Obviously, there's a part of where I want to, a lot of those books are talking about different kind of angles by which you can kind of introduce people to ideas or little papers and thoughts about like, hey, ideas are practically eyes, hey, meta moves, meta talks with your spouse, like looking for angles, because it's almost like I want to say, Alex, because it's an excellent question. I want to say that like people all in their life circumstances have various tensions they're dealing with, right? And every one of those tensions, I would argue, there's potentially a philosophical idea where if you just had this one, it would make a difference. For this person, it's something at work. For this person, it's something in their marriage. For this person, it's with their purpose. And if there was one paper out of, let's say, and I'm just making an example of it. So you got 200 little essays, papers with thoughts, for example. And if there was one idea, or you were speaking with a friend and you kind of discerned, they need to know about meta talks, right? And you introduce them because you're prepared for that random subject that this person brings up, and you've done the work and you have that one idea. And then they take it and they go, okay, well, I have nothing else to lose, and they try it and it makes a difference. That is a big deal because you've now made them experience how a philosophical idea can change their life. And if it could happen once, why couldn't it happen again and again and again? Once they've tasted, oh wait, this actually makes a difference. Well, now they get it. They're in the case. And so there's no telling how far they go. Now, maybe they only get 5, maybe they only do 5 more ideas. Who knows? But you've at least introduced them to the very tangible, real possibility that ideas can change your life. Wow, most people have never, I will make an argument that most people have not had the experience where ideas truly change your life. They've not felt it. It's not happened to them, right? Okay. If you were the kind of person who, in interacting with someone, could discern this one idea, and maybe, this one idea that could make a very big difference for them in their particular circumstances. And let's say you did that to 15 people in your life, and those 15 people thus had the very emotional, tangible experience of ideas making a difference. That is a huge deal. And if those 15 did 15, et cetera, so forth, right? And then I'll throw it to you on any thoughts. So basically, for me, on this question of how you get someone to philosophize their life, I think there is something to be said about, one, your own particular relationships you're in and people you meet, and having done enough reading, writing, thinking, and articulation and oration that when that person just brings up subject X by chance on one day at lunch, you kind of can see, and you're not just forcing it. It's not poured in from the top. You're saying, no, this is real. This person could really use the idea of meta talks. And you also learn to talk about meta talks when you introduce it, not in a manner where you're saying you need it, because people don't respond well to that, where you say something instead, where you say like, yeah, no, I've had similar situations, something that that for me, I was in big trouble until I thought about is trying to, like, if I was having a kind of a fight with someone, to kind of step back and sort of kind of look at, like, are they wrong? Like, what is happening in the space between us? Because we know we both care about one another, that would actually lead us to fighting in the name of our care for one another. So what you do is you say, what I found is by stepping back and looking over, that helped me approach the problem in a new way. And then so what you do is you make an example of your own lived experience that you show to them, that then they can choose to receive or not, right? Because often if you just tell someone directly, you need X, that the neurotic, the self-deception, all of that, doesn't go so well. But if there's a skill you've developed to figure out how to introduce an idea in a manner that and why are you doing it though? You're doing it because you genuinely believe it would be helpful for them. Like, it would genuinely open up beauty. It's not because you're like, I want to spread philosophy. It's like, no, I believe in philosophy. I believe ideas can change your life and improve situations. And here's an example of it, right? Like, that skill of discernment and which idea, like, it sounds simple, but you're only going to, like, have that idea and present it in the right way at the right time if basically you've been spending a lot of time regularly going through all possible ideas, all possible, having conversations about things you don't think you're ever going to need or whatever, because you had that repertoire of all that stuff that seemed useless. Then you had that thing of which actually kind of came out to open horizons, right? So that is a part of the question that you asked, but I'll pause.
That was great. It makes me think of taking up the stance of preparing oneself that you can discuss with those meta moves, and that sort of it rings the bell of, like, I mean, that's like one avenue of, like, Plato's cave, of like the dragging and who drags and how that occurs. I wrote down that acts of courage and keeping that stance of being playful, which it's another balance of forgetting and remembering, and it's relates to how I've thought about, a poor way to describe it is like just like genuinely doing what you want to do in the moment. Like, and that has to be scratched at more, but it's like, just, when you're walking around the mall, like, some person walks up to the same shelf as you and you're like, oh, I'm a big fan of that. I'm not going to get it because I prefer this thing. And they're like, oh, really? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, just that small thing. Like, I've gotten recently I've just been doing that, and I've gotten like 5 people's phone numbers, and they're just people who do, financial stuff, people who make a lot of money, people who don't make a lot of money. And I'm I do that just in my everyday life, but when me and my youths are out in the community, I like part of me is just like, I hope they notice that, and that they can establish the courage to do these things, because I wouldn't have met Daniel Garner if not I'd talked to David McCarricker and to Matthew Stanley. And just that, like, it killed me on the inside to even speak up in a Zoom call when I was first in Theory Underground. I was just like, these guys are talking so much language that I haven't heard before, and I don't know what I'm talking about. But it's just like that feeling of like, I have something to say, I don't know what it is. And you know retroactively now, it's like it was an act of courage, of discovering oneself, of like, when you're a kid, you play, and then you imagine yourself back then playing, and you're like, just the imagination, and that you can actually, like, you have the power to create something. You have the power to create a space, and you can, people will resonate with that. And it, like you said, opens up horizons. And it's that pingings of shines and glimmers from other people. And like you said, bringing those meta moves. Another thing you've emphasized in previous conversations with others is what's the word? It's not metaphor. What's the A word after that?
Analogy. Yep.
Analogy. And like I've sort of changed my stance on this, but like, those, like those small phrases, those analogies where man, I wish I had an example. It's just like, it's almost too simple. It's just like, ah, yes, how profound. And it could be a dismissal of just like, wow, that's pretty deep, bro. And that's why I don't like them, is because it's a dismissal filler. I memorized this because I saw it on Instagram or whatever, which is, that can be cool. If it really hits you, then that's fantastic. That's fantastic. But it's a tough, I don't know, conversation to be in. But like you said, and this brings in the idea of faith and courage, of just like planting those seeds and focusing on your own shine and seeing the shine in others, which is a perpetual motion machine. And yeah, it makes me, I don't know why, like, Ivan Illich is somewhere in this line of thought. I haven't
Yeah.
read him in such a long time, but it makes me think about education and spaces like that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Illich's all over that. So a bunch of things, magnificent. So first, yes, with the shine, and the thing is with the shine though, is that the shine brings out the real, and and is dangerous because once you shine, then people come closer, and as people come closer, then the real
Mm.
and the surprise comes out. The key, shine is indeed emancipatory politics and extraordinarily dangerous. And yet we must deal with that danger now. Because, if you're dealing with shine is the appearance of the joy which brings judgment. It is not simply the shine of be like me. That's kind of neurotic. Those are all of those problems. It's like, no, it's a call to higher reality, a higher
Mm.
life. But a call to higher life you must go through purgatory to higher life. Like you must change your life in the real way. So there's something also about the shine that is tied to basically a vision of something that would say the purgatory is worth it. Like actually dealing with the messiness of human relations is worth it. right? And that, like, we today don't believe, like, you could argue that people today generally don't believe that personal relationships are worth it. They may say they do, but basically the idea of a good relationship avoids mess. And they may say, no, it doesn't. But the way that they behave and act, yeah, it does. It's about the systemization of the human into a program, right? And, you know, a way that you really can avoid the messiness of human relations is to reduce difference and pluralism and try to get people as similar as possible. And all, well, that's all algorithmic then. That's the logic of kind of the algorithm. So people have to believe that the work of difference is worth it. And can you actually live such a life that would make it plausible to yourself that the work of difference is worth it? Because if you can't do that, then you won't be shining. And if shining as such is the only way to bring about collective action for emancipatory politics, then this is the hard road is the only road left. But I do think it is the only road where belonging again can be found, and without belonging again, we perish. Anyway, I think also what you're saying on analogy, there is absolutely a form of analogy that is used as a surface. Analogy in the Kripke Aristotelian sense that was funny. The Aristotle sense has to be a space you enter to. Analogy has to be an invitation into a wrestling. It cannot just be a one-off dismissal. There's like the problem with analogy is just like shine. It's extremely dangerous because it works. But also that's why it's necessary. Like we have to go into the dangerous things. Like metaphors are dangerous. But the problem is if we don't think metaphors and analogy are a bit different. Metaphor is like she runs like a cheetah. An analogy would be she is a cheetah. Now, the second one is interesting because it's like, how is she a cheetah? Like you have to enter in and to think about it. But in the first one, I say she runs like a cheetah. Oh, okay, I get it. She's fast, right? But if I say she is a cheetah, notice how it's more of a space you have to go into and occupy and think about and explore, right? Which ultimately, here's the key, analogy is an invitation to discernment and judgment. Like you make a decision. This is how they're like a cheetah. This is how, well, you're personally involved in, you better think. So when analogy is used to dismiss thinking, or it's used as a kind of one-off or to do the work of thinking, it's a simulacra. But it works so well because analogy is such a big deal. And I mean, when you follow Hofstadter or Kripke, we like all thought is analogical. That's the problem. Like it's all analogical. We're already doing it. The issue is we need to get good at it, but we have a temptation not to, because I could use a simulacra of it to keep out otherness versus invite otherness into a space. Yeah, that would require you to have done the work on your nervous system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that's a very big deal. I think also what I want to say is I really, really, really cannot stress enough the importance of doing what you were describing, where you speak up to the people around you, where you say something. This is a massive deal. Yeah, just as a practical note, acknowledge the people around you in your life. Say hi. Look up from your effing phone. Like people don't like they have freaking earphones. I'm not like you're walking in a park listening with something in your ear. Okay, I'm not going to say that's never okay. I'm not going to say that's not a point, but look at yourself look at yourself good and hard and ask, am I doing this because I don't want to be bothered? Or am I doing this because what I'm listening to is really engaging and this is the only time I have to listen to it? That's what like you really have to look at yourself. Am I trying to avoid being bothered? Okay, don't worry. I get the not wanting to be bothered. Been there, done. I'm working on something. Totally get it. And there's a place for concentration and there's a place for that. Do not let that logic overfit and define your constant going through the world, or you're doomed. Like the thing also I just want to say, because those are the little micro actions that build up your courage. Like people are the reason, again, I don't I'm not saying phones are evil. I'm saying they're very dangerous because they're so useful. Like that's the rub. All the best of things are the worst of things in the iliac sense, right? Like they invert, right? And I know he has his like 100-year birthday, and I know Stanley's doing stuff, so that's great. And it's really ilic's amazing. But every time you try to avoid looking that person in the eyes at the counter, or every time you choose not to speak, those are little micro actions that greatly reduce the probability you will have the courage to face the event or the surprising of which the failure to meet closes off major possibilities in your life, right? And so those little actions can be the little steps. And like you say, they open possibility, right? They open possibility. Like that is the responsible way to live your life, because it's full of the ability to respond. And if you're not like engaging with the environment around you, if you're not, then these things can't happen. So yeah, it's like life is boring, nothing occurs. Yeah, because you're not doing the little actions that actually make it there, that make the world there, dang it. And I think also, I guess just as a note, that extremely important training now. And I do think there's something about learning to speak and speaking in a new way that is at ground zero of the formation of the emancipatory subject, like language. We all know that language makes the subject uniquely from psychoanalysis and other people, right? So the way you speak really, really impacts who you are. And what kind of speaking you can do really impacts what kind of being you are. Now, that does not mean you necessarily have to speak a lot. You have to learn the art of speaking, which sometimes will mean you speak a lot, but other times may mean that you have the skill to identify the one sentence that needs to be said at the right moment to actually change the situation, right? So it's not a quantitative thing, it's a qualitative thing, right? The art of speaking seems uniquely important in global interconnectivity and globalization because you're dealing with so many ideas in the globe on your back. And there's something about language that is processing. Can you do it through art? Can you do it through gymnastics? Sure. Yeah, you can. But there is, I think, different historical moments have different emphasis. That doesn't mean language is the only thing, but the emphasis today, I do think, is on language. And I'm belonging again will hopefully make that case. I'm not trying to say that shoulder to shoulder people or whatever, therefore bad. But it's if you're going to be interconnected and in relationships under philosophical consciousness, you are going to require the ability to mediate complexity, mediate contradiction and tension. And language, like I don't know how you do that between people without communication. Like, could you do dance? Could you kind of could you do these things? I think, yeah, at key moments, but the context of that dance will be determined by language. And our short story about that's called Esperanza. So that's kind of like Under the Wing kind of explores all these different tensions. But anyway, there's something about language that's at ground zero. And these spaces online, Theory Underground, etc., that one service of providing a place where you have the experience of, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to say. There is all these languages. I'm going to open my mouth and sound like a fool. And maybe you just go to 15 classes for 1 year and never say a word. But then that one day comes where you say, I'm doing it. And then you do it. And it's really hard. And then afterwards you say, I'm sorry, I don't know if that made sense. And you do all of those kind of gestures or whatever. Okay. This is like introducing the one idea into the person's life that then they find out philosophy matters. Like that one step of speaking out, this truly can change your life. Because you have now you've taken that step, and then you take it again, and you take it again, and you take it again, and you learn to have confidence in your voice. That means you're going to have confidence in your person. And if you don't have confidence in your person, then when the event comes, the surprise of the possibility of emancipatory politics, you won't take it. You're not going to take it because I can tell you, even if you become a master speaker, those key moments are still hard, dang it. Like, even if you like do the work of like the training that you need, the key moments are always incredibly difficult, right? Well, I'm not saying it's impossible if you ain't done the training, but it seems practically impossible, even if not technically impossible, right? It's not a bet I would want to take. It's not, I don't think that would be good risk management, if you will. But but I'll stop. But the point is that stepping into, like speaking extensively, I'm going to like that other, also that learn, I'm going to speak to finish a thought. That is a major deal. Like I'm going to speak to present something that then can be critiqued or assented to, or like I'm going to speak when I don't know what I'm going to say. This determines if you're the kind of person who can do something when you don't know what's going to happen. If you're going to be able to do something till it's finished. If you're going to be able to see the work of overcoming self-deception to the end, right? These habits of speech determine what you do as a person in your life. And if that's all tied to emancipatory politics, then those first steps of speaking really can go a long way to what you as a subject are capable of, and therefore if you're capable of shine, and also handling the judgment of joy that comes with shine, and also to handle the work of the meta move and seeing the water and not being overwhelmed by bearing that globe on your back like the philosophical atlas. Like, so that step of speaking, like if in a very real way, like in this question of how do you get people to do philosophy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there's a very real argument to be made that if you just focused on getting people to take that step of speaking, then the rest would follow. Like that would actually open them up to the rest. Like that first step of speaking. And just creating spaces where you gather young people together to do that. And this is, yeah, it's tied to education because I want to replace the test structure with a return to oral tradition. I want it like oral education. I'm all about changing the classroom as a medium to making speaking the main indicator of intelligence and et cetera, and capacity versus test taking. Test taking is not the kind of use of subjectivity we want to stress today. It is speaking. That's what we want to stress. So I want to change the school system in its medium as a classroom to a facilitator of stuff like we're doing here. I think this is a matter of life and death, basically. Now, happy to get into that. But yes, creating spaces where people could just do that step. This is emancipatory politics. Now, I will argue it tends to be the case that those kind of conversations are philosophical, not because you say we want them to be philosophical, but because philosophical concepts have a kind of free play of the signifier. There's a playfulness that's possible because it doesn't have to be exact. It could be more analogous or fuzzy that allows a person to speak extensively because they are exploring an idea. But if you just ask me, what's the weather? Sunny. There's nothing to explore, right? So conversations that train the subject in the way we're describing tend to be philosophical because that creates a kind of use of words and signifiers that are more playful. And you brought this up, and you don't become an adult unless you learn to play. The Nietzschean child, that's the secret, is that this playfulness of the signifier tends to be the kind of conversation that allows a person to train themselves in the extensive speech or the courageous speech of which they cannot turn to become the subject they need to be to handle global pluralism without. But that's not because you say philosophy is what we want to do. It's what tends to occur to facilitate that speech act. And that's really important to kind of see because then you're not so nervous about, oh gosh, I've got to get them to read Plato, Aristotle, they got to read all the classical. No, your job, if you're facilitating, is to get people to do the speech act, to take the step. And then, funny enough, that tends to actually create curiosity for philosophy. Why is that? Because they then have curiosity for signifiers that have the free play capacity. That's what ends up happening. You get used to using language in this playful way. So then you're attracted to fields where language is used in that playful way. And that tends to be in the arts, philosophy, theology. That's where the signifiers have this kind of structure. And you then get attracted to those kind of works because you're attracted to that use of language because you've come to experience how that changes you as a person into a subject that has more confidence and courage to handle the unknown. So the order is really important because then when you're asking how do you get people into philosophy, it's like get them to take steps of courage, and particularly this step of the speaking up and taking that step out. That is the kind of starting condition that kind of opens the floodgates for the rest. And I think when you think of it, and then I'll stop. When you think of it that way, I think it becomes a much more doable project, if you will. Like it becomes a much more doable project because you know your goal. My goal is not to get them to know the history of philosophy. My goal is to create conditions where for 15 weeks they're too scared to say anything until the day where they do. And now they've begun the development. Now they've begun the work. Now they've taken that step. Now they've experienced language in this new way. And that can open up the other horizons. So no, that's speaking is a major deal, and I guess and your ability to do that is probably corollary. If you need to start with saying something to that person next to you in the CVS. Start with that. Start with the looking someone in the eyes. Start with the learning to hold a conversation with that person. Don't be scared of people, and then you start those little steps toward the ability to speak. So those were thoughts.
It's just most examples in my life where memorable and where there was change and where I sort of cut myself open like that. Can't tell you what happened at the time in my spirit, in my brain, but it just, you break and you gotta live with that. And, you think about the break and to have someone to talk to And it's nice to have someone to talk to, an establishing partner, family, and maybe it could just perhaps be this person at CVS, the cashier. And it doesn't have to be this whole spilling your beans. It could just, there's the casual break where you're not normally supposed to do this because we're moving on with our lives. It's oh, how's your day? You know what? You know what, man? My sister and I have this thing and I'm not sure what to do. And you know, you might get something simple or you might get Tammy, who is a particular person and has this particular experience. She's like, "Well, me and my sister, we've had fights and blah blah blah." And it's that courage to cast out and be like, "Oh, this person's actually meeting me here in this space to investigate this." And um maybe right now is not the space, but maybe we can meet again, something of the sort. It makes me think of what Peter Rollins is doing with the pyrotheology and just all the things he talks about with like these art shows and creation spaces and these rituals or just invitations to explore oneself and maybe even explore the topology where you find one space connecting back to itself. And yeah, makes this conversation makes you want to have more conversations to continue that flow and um, shine in a sense. And it's that conditioning of when the break occurs and just feels like you're dying. Yeah, it's all good stuff.
No, I mean magnificent. I definitely think that the fate there is something about like the fate of everything that is really tied to changing how we use language, our relationship to language. Like it is really, really at ground zero. Now, of course, the question becomes, okay, what are the material conditions by which you then facilitate a change in language, or do you just tell people to change language, right? Well, gets into the all the belonging again stuff, from the social coordination mechanism as a medium condition to analysis on the Nordic Bildung, different school system models, blah blah blah. Right. But step one is, of course, modeling it yourself and doing it. And a reason why, I believe in doing these conversations and like posting them and putting them online is because like a lot of people don't even know they can do it, or they have permission to do that, or they think there's something wrong with them. Like we have to build a new plausibility structure in a certain regard, like as Berger talks about. Like it has to become plausible to people that this kind of use of language is available to people not at college, who have normal jobs, who do it because they think it is valuable to them with friends, and that they do it regularly and often. Like, oh, really? Like when you see people doing it, you go, well, maybe I should do that. Maybe I could do that, right? It becomes plausible to people. Like there's a way in which I call this use of language, in honor of my beloved Tim Adlin, voice craft. There's a certain voice craft, which is the opposite of Kafka likeness. Like most of the time, we're using language like a Kafka novel that just leads us into our entrapment or discourse, as the Frankfurt School says. Like that's the other issue is like there's no middle. You're either using language under global pluralism for Kafka likeness to kind of pull yourself somewhere you don't want to go to structure your consciousness to your capture, or you're using language as voicecraft, which is leading to your own light of flight that does not destroy social intelligibility, right? Like, the use of language is ground zero for if you're captured or not. And because you capture yourself by your own formation of your own consciousness. And then we tend to blame the big other, but there is no big brother, only us. And, we're our big brother based on how we use language and thus form ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the spread of voicecraft is like the question becomes, how do you spread voicecraft and childhood go together thus? Because I think the way you use language determines your subjectivity. I think they're two sides of the same coin. So voicecraft is the use of language of the Nietzschean child, which is also tied to the absolute knower and all of that jazz, right? But the point is, on this kind of question of how do you spread voicecraft? Well, I think we're in the age of basically making voicecraft. We're creating the plausibility structure for voicecraft. That's kind of what we're doing. This is the age of making it plausible to people that this is worth doing. And yeah, there's this question of how do you get people on board? Well, there's another say it's like, well, what we're doing is you got to first make it plausible to people that they ought to get on board, right? And how do you do that? Well, that's culture making. That's a gradual process of more and more people who, for some reason in their individual circumstances, they go, yeah, I'm on board. Why? Well, they probably have a unique circumstance, et cetera, so forth, but you get more and more people. And let's say you get to 10,000 people. I mean, let's say you get to 2 million people. Okay, there's 2 million people who are doing voicecraft, who are modeling it. That's going to start creating a plausibility structure, especially if there are videos that people can see. It gains plausibility. We are in the phase of creating in my opinion, this is the phase of building the plausibility structure for voicecraft. It's been going on about almost 10 years. I would put it around 2018. And the reason I would do that is because that's when availability to faster internet, Zoom technology, and YouTube became more widely available to people. And the cost of doing videos and the logistical difficulty began to drop radically. It began to fall radically. Now, obviously, COVID was the great accelerator. But, there's this... That's kind of when the infrastructure began to be more readily available. Now, obviously, there was telecommunication technology way before that, but I'm saying the availability of people, 2015, 2018. So, this period, and those are not exact numbers. I'm placing it there. This work of building the plausibility structure has been going on for like a decade now. Right. And the conditions of which would make people care to build this plausibility structure start arguably in the beginning of 2001, because that's when institutions begin to fail and the kind of need for avoiding institutional capture and all of that begins. Right. So we're building the plausibility structure. Well, as you build that, then the next phase begins. It becomes plausible to people that maybe we need to change the schoolroom and the material conditions and how we use colleges and how we use money. And maybe we need to have new investment technologies to support the social coordination mechanism. So you have this kind of process. Now, I'm happy to get into all of that, but that's kind of the culture making process. And we are in the building of the plausibility structure. And we have to therefore keep doing it and value it. This is the phase of faithful presence. Like as Hunter says, okay, it doesn't seem like anything is happening. But I believe in this, and exponential. Like culture making is exponential. It's not linear. Now, in my strong opinion. So that means you have to go through 20 years of are we just wasting our time? Yeah, because it looks like you're wasting your time until you're not. That old famous example. I think we mentioned it last time. If I have a jar that's on an exponential curve and it starts at noon and it's full all the way to the top at 1 p.m., the question is the following: at what time is the jar halfway? Most people will say 12:30. Nope, 12:59, and then it's full. So that means for 55 minutes, it looks like nothing is happening. It's not even until the 56th minute that it looks like anything is happening, and then suddenly, bam, it's really fast. That's how culture making works, in my strong opinion. Is that it's nothing, bam, and then it has a kind of takeoff. Right. But that's only going to occur if people are doing the faithful presence for the jar to fill up, for the little beads to multiply. If people give up and say this is a waste of time, well, then there's no multiplication occurring because there aren't people there to do it. So I do think we're at the phase. We are on the phase of making voicecraft plausible to people as a plausibility structure, and plausible to people that it actually does open social, political, and economic opportunities, emancipations. And as you make it plausible to people, you then increase the likelihood that a person is willing to try it. Well, I think I've kind of been pointing to in this conversation of that. How do you get the person to take the first step? Because once they take the first step, that's like a paradigmatic shift. Once they take the first step, they tasted it. Well, that's a massive deal. The first step is the hardest, right? So you build a plausibility structure, which increases the likelihood that a person takes the first step. And then here's the other key. the more people that take the first step, the higher the probability that more people take the step. That's the kind of threshold theory, right? So the first people to take the steps are the crazy ones. They only, they're the crazy ones, right? But it's like the Alex Ebert will talk about the dancing Sasquatch man. We have this one guy in the hill and he's dancing like a crazy person, and then 3 other people join. Well, now the threshold is 4. There's 4 people. So anyone who just needs a threshold of 4 people dancing, get up. And then anyone who has a threshold of 8 people dancing, then get up. And then anyone 16 in it, and it cascades. And then the whole hillside is dancing, right? Because of this. But you needed a few crazy people whose threshold was 0 or 1 or 3. But they then increase the probability of other people doing it, right? So so the movement is this: plausibility structure increases for voicecraft. You then get a few people to take the first steps following threshold theory, which increases the likelihood other people will step. And as that occurs, that's when the exponential occurs, because you break through the threshold. And that's how culture is made. And that's what we're doing. And basically, if we don't learn voicecraft, global pluralism is going to destroy us, because we're going to get crushed by that giant philosophical globe on our back, as Sloterdijk is talking about. But I will throw it to you on any thoughts on anything, Alex.
Really good. I don't think I got anything.
Well, this has been a delight. Alex, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time, sir.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too, sir.